the reality is, you alluded to it earlier, which is if you've gone through professional schooling, you have a certain trade or a certain skill set that can't survive you, then in the moment in which you're no longer surviving, the chances that annuity or that asset is worth nearly as much as it was the moment before you were no longer surviving goes down dramatically, right? So it's different if your you know a child has the same skill set and they're in line. There's a succession plan and they're in line to take over the business. That's a very different mindset or conversation than I'm truly the end of the line here. In the moment that ends, especially if you do have a spouse, think about the stress you're potentially adding to your spouse or significant other or family for that matter. In the event that it isn't accounted for or there isn't a succession plan in place.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to a brand new episode of the None of Your Business podcast. Shawn and Lacey here with you. Super excited for today. We have a very interesting discussion. This is like the holy grail discussion of every single entrepreneur. Like you enter into your business, you start to develop your business, but nobody ever thinks about the end game. Like when does this end? One of the worst things that I have to announce to all of our listeners and viewers, I have to make this this terrible announcement to you, is that you are all going to die.
It's
Every
true.
single one of you. We're building a service-based business. We're serving a ton of people. The goal is to serve as many people as possible. And over time, we build this massive business, this massive practice. We're making inroads. We're making a huge impact. We never really stop to consider, well, what does it look like when I exit? What is the end game? What do I do? How does it work? And I got to tell you too, as my wife, one of the worst things that can happen is that I build this massive business, service-based business, especially in
Mm.
healthcare, and then I pass away. And you're like, what do
What do
I
I do
do?
next, right? If I wasn't a chiropractor and you had a chiropractic office, and then I'm just left holding the keys to this business and don't know what to
Well, and then
do. That's hard.
the sharks start circling. They start showing up and they're like, "Hey, Lacey, I'll give you $10
Yeah.
for that." And you're kind of stuck. There's nothing really that you
I don't know how to work
can
it.
do.
I don't know how to
You
sell
can't
it. I
work it.
don't know how you built it. I don't know what the ultimate goal was.
So I'm super excited about this because we have a true expert. One, because he's an expert. Two, because he's done it.
Lived it.
You don't always have to do things to make yourself an expert, but I think in this case, it's super useful that
Yes.
you've navigated the process. So, we're going to be talking today about the pitfalls, the things you need to think about in advance, the glory of having a successful exit. So, let's welcome in Dr. Ryan Wakim. He is the end game coach. So, if you're thinking end game at all, if you're like, hey, this might have an end, or I should have an
Or I
end
was gonna say,
game,
or if you're not thinking end game, but you know you need to have one,
you
need
need
an end game
you need
coach.
Ryan
Yeah,
Wakem.
that's
So
right.
Ryan, we begin every single podcast with this question. We already alluded to it, like you've already successfully navigated it, an end game. But here's what happens every single time we do a podcast. Our viewers and our listeners are like, "All right, great. So you have Ryan Wakem. Who is that? He was probably here because his father." His family had a successful exit. So here he is to tell us how you can make gazillions of dollars doing an exit. But that's not really the case. You've had to learn this through the school of hard knocks. You've paid the dummy tax on this. Tell us a little bit about how we end up here. How do you end up being the end game coach?
Well, I'll begin with the end in mind, which is, well, first of all, thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be able to share this story and potentially help many others. But this whole idea was born out of an event that I had in my life where I was approached by a private equity group. I'd built six group practices. I'm a psychiatrist by trade, entrepreneur by passion, and went through this extensive due diligence process, and along the lines realized, I wish I knew more, right? You don't know what you don't know. I paid many dummy taxes along the way, but due diligence is being this kind of 6 month, significantly stressful period of your life where all your stresses are kind of combined into one time frame. I just remember thinking in that moment, I really wish I had someone to help me. I wish I had someone who I knew that understood this process. I really wish I had a mentor or coach for this moment. And sale happens, life goes on, and I have a history in coaching, and as a psychiatrist, I've I've done a lot in the mental health space and in thought processes and behavior changes. And so for me, the true purpose I found was how could I go out and help others do what I did, and again, help them not have to pay those dummy taxes, help them make original mistakes, and be the mentor, either before, during, or after that sale process. Because to your point, Shawn and Lacey, we often, as providers, as service professionals, we often start something and grow something and don't actually know where it's going. And it's not until you're in that moment that you realize, man, I've learned a lot along the way, but I really wish I knew how to navigate this last piece as I go towards a sale or an exit.
Let's jump to the beginning of this story. Everybody's building their practice in the service-based business, whether it's in the healthcare space or in other spaces. You might be building a hair salon and you just think, I'm going to be cutting hair forever. What I want to do is get as many stylists as possible in here and build my empire. And people are not thinking about their exit. I'm sure when you started out, you weren't like, hey, this is how I'm going to exit. But at some point, this sort of dawns on you, either intentionally, hopefully through this podcast, or accidentally, like somebody comes along and is like, hey, have you ever thought about selling? But when that happens, there's a lot of things that we haven't really even considered. In fact, that might be the moment when we realize we've committed a lot of mistakes. Let's talk about some of the initial the advice that you would give to people to help to eradicate some of these mistakes that might end up being super costly to somebody as they even just are entering into the discussions about an exit.
Yeah. So early, or in the process and afterward, and what I've been coaching or mentoring others to do now is make sure you have everything, for lack of a better way of putting it, papered up. There are so many, vendor relationships and intercompany relationships and contracts that really were handshakes or understood, but not necessarily on paper. So I have a client right now I'm coaching through a process, and it's super important as we build his data rooms. We've not even gone out to an investment banker yet, but as we look at getting ready to do that, making sure that everything's documented, even if it's one-page documents to say, this is what we do and this is how we do it. Sign here, I'll sign there. At least now it's documented. When you go through a diligence process and you have tens of dozens of vendors and maybe all sorts of different relationships, both inter-company and extra company, you'd be surprised at what you didn't think to get into place in the moment in time it was happening. Day to day in the business world is very rapid, fast paced, and even though it might be an understanding and you might understand how it goes, a potential financer or financial backer would want to make sure that that's actually memorialized in a document. So legal documentation, even if it's super simple, is pretty critical in getting through that process. Because the worst thing you want to ask your due diligence partners is, well, what if I didn't have that in writing somewhere? What is that going to mean? Right. So you're in the middle of a diligence process, and you can't find a countersigned document, you can't find a document at all. What could that mean for your deal? And the reality is that could mean you don't have a deal anymore.
Mm.
And that would be a pretty rough position to be in.
I want to talk about, because you're talking about a financer. I want to talk about this mistake that I see a lot of business owners do. I think that you're going to say it's a mistake, but a lot of entrepreneurs, when they're running their business, one of their goals is to make teeny tiny, right? Because of taxes. And so oftentimes they're running a lot of things through the business that may not be considered always like hard expenses for the business. How would you help somebody navigate this thought process? Because it's a mindset thing, right? Like, I don't want to pay a ton of taxes, and I could run this through my business, but then if I want to sell it, how does that look? And what should they do?
Yeah, it's similar, right? So most financial backers are going to come in and do a calculation around EBITDA, adjusted EBITDA, some sort of financial calculation. And so if you're running a bunch of stuff through your business and you don't really have a lot of EBITDA, you have to go through and explain why that is. And so even just looking at the financial side, that's the other kind of big ticket item. Wrapping the two big steps of diligence really are what's called a QOV, or quality of earnings, which is a financial, forensic accounting audit, and that's where they get into your actual margins, your actual expenses. And that's where, if you're running, your Sam's Club bills and every single possible car and potential personal payment through, you're going to have to spend a lot of time on QOV and with the forensic accounting team, understanding or helping them understand what's really there and what's not. So truly untying all of that in a sale. So if you think about anything that isn't going to go along with your sale, if you drive a car, it's very common to put that car in a business. You might want to do that in a mechanism through which you can easily untie it, and again have it documented where you can easily explain it, because you start getting into a ton of commingling and a ton of expenses that are really tough to untie. Again, that's another position you can put yourself in where maybe there's no longer a deal to be had. So there are ways around that. There are different shell companies you can set up and different pass-throughs, so you can still take advantage from a tax perspective, but not necessarily have it tied to a business you might eventually sell. That again could cause complication. And when it comes to this diligence process, even if it's explainable, even if it's truly above board and okay, if you start creating a lot of extra stress for yourself in that process, that ultimately makes things a lot more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Some people might be listening along and they might be thinking, "Oh, but I don't want to sell my business." We run into that a lot, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm literally, my dreams to die
In my business.
I want to be sitting there
Taking care of someone.
taking notes as a psychiatrist, and I just want to just like fall over right there, and the patient's like, "Are you okay?"
Doc?
Why should somebody even consider this idea of selling a business? Why is this so important that we're talking about this today?
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, you alluded to it earlier, which is if you've gone through professional schooling, you have a certain trade or a certain skill set that can't survive you, then in the moment in which you're no longer surviving, the chances that annuity or that asset is worth nearly as much as it was the moment before you were no longer surviving goes down dramatically, right? So it's different if you're, you know, a child has the same skill set and they're in line, there's a succession plan and they're in line to take over the business. That's a very different, mindset or conversation than, I'm truly the end of the line here. In the moment that ends, especially, if you do have a spouse, think about the stress you're potentially adding to your spouse or significant other or family for that matter, in the event that it isn't accounted for or there isn't a succession plan in place and something were to happen. So there's truly the value of the business, and again, if there's some lineage that can take it over and continue with it, then keeping that asset within the family makes a lot of sense. But if that doesn't exist, it basically becomes worthless, almost, the second that there isn't a plan in place.
Yeah. So let's say that now I'm a business owner, I'm an entrepreneur, and I am convinced that I am ready to sell my business.
Or maybe not ready, but you're ready even to consider it.
Consider it, I guess. Yeah.
Hopefully you're young
young enough, because
and
then you
you're
create all
you
the
got
that
a
you got
runway.
runway. You can create all the things that you need to do to make the business super viable, worth a lot of money, so that you can sell it. But what would my next step be? My very first thing that I need
Well,
to
other
do,
than hiring Ryan,
obviously. But what else?
So, if you're thinking about selling outside of hiring me to get you in the mindset of what it needs to look like for you to sell, there's a couple of different routes you can take. So, it's not uncommon to hire an investment banker and you run an actual process where you get a confidential investment memo or a SIM. You put that out to market. You allow individuals who are interested in your space or your business to go to bid against one another, to buy it. A lot of people do proprietary deals. They happen to know someone either in the area or they've been connected to private equity or VC funding who might have interest in doing what's considered a proprietary deal where you're really just engaging with them directly. That's what I ended up doing and didn't have a banker, an investment banker involved. So the plus side was I didn't have to give anyone a cut of my sale. The downside is I didn't have anyone to help me navigate my sale. And that's really, part of the niche that I can come into, which is maybe you don't need an investment banker, maybe you don't need to go, take it to bid per se, and maybe you should do that, and that's a conversation we should have. But specifically, if you don't, and don't get me wrong, an investment banker is not going to be your mentor. They're going to do what's best for lining their pockets and for creating, the best deal for you. They have a fiduciary duty to do that, but they're not going to help you. They can't help you through the process. They don't know the full process. They understand the pieces of the process. But to be the business owner in the diligence process and keep your business moving forward, because again, a deal stopper could be, well, since we started engaging in diligence, your business has fallen off 20%. That wouldn't be a good thing. So you really have to straddle both sides of the fence. You have to be able to continue to run your business as you were and keep growing it. And you have to be able to run this diligence process, basically off the side of your desk. And to not have someone that can help you do that, whether that's an investment banker or someone like myself, could really be of a detriment. And to me, it was incredibly stressful. So, that's really where my value comes in, but also where next steps could be for someone who is in the mindset already of maybe going the route of doing a deal, might be to get an investment banker or a coach or a mentor to walk them or help them through that process.
So I always like to make sure that everybody doesn't have to wait until the very end of the podcast to connect with Dr. Ryan Wakim. How do people find you? And then we'll continue on. I have a few more questions. I want to know about the process, but how do people find you? What if somebody is like, yeah, I need that. I need to talk to
get
Dr.
started.
Ryan.
I need to talk this through.
Where did they go?
Yeah, so you can go to endgame.coach, which would provide you some preliminary information about how we can engage in a conversation from there, as well as get some free content to kind of highlight some of the stuff we talk about today. And then, beyond that, it's really a sphere of influence and inner circle referrals. So, hoping to continue to engage with groups that I'm already involved with and will continue to be over time.
www.endgame.coach. If you need an in-game coach, that's where you go. Dr. Ryan Wakim. He's here to help you to navigate that. Now, in your case, just to make sure that everybody understands, you didn't exit out of just one practice. You had multiple practices. But what about somebody that only has one? Do we need to have multiple offices to start planning our exit? Is that the first step? How does that change if I do have multiples? If I don't need to have multiples, but I do have multiples, what does that do to the process?
Keyword being multiples. So multiples creates multiples, right? So specifically with private equity, but even VC funding, they really want to see that you've done it more than once, right? So once is kind of the natural fit. When they see you can run 2, 3, 4 offices plus, that really is there's inherent value into that beyond just economies of scale and centralization of services. So having multiple locations does create a higher multiple on exit. That being said, it's not uncommon through what's called a mergers and acquisition strategy, an M&A strategy, to do something called a tuck-in, which is if you are just one office, but you have to happen to be co-located near a group of other practices that may already be part of this roll-up strategy, they might approach you to bring you into that geographical group as what's called a tuck-in. You could still make good money doing that, even at just one practice. But again, it's not going to be at the multiples as if you had multiple locations.
I heard you mention a couple of times about the process and there being challenges, like a lot of challenges throughout that process. And I'm sure there's a lot of people that are thinking like, oh, I could sell my office. That sounds super easy. Well, it sounds super easy if I'm just selling it to like Shawn, this single guy that wants to maybe even take
Well,
over.
Ryan does a great job too of like, oh, you just find these investment
Yeah,
bankers
there's
and
gotta
then you
be
just sell
there's
your
gotta be
office.
hiccups and turbulence and whitewater and challenges. So tell us about some of those that people could run into and need to have the mindset to be prepared for.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of potential hurdles and pitfalls, right? Even before the diligence process, and especially right now, with the way the debt markets are looking, there's going to even be a little bit more of a hurdle right now to consider. The private equity groups are conserving powder, so to speak. So to go out there as to get a single office deal right now is probably pretty tough. However, and Shawn, I know you and Lacey have talked about this. I know, Dave Meltzer's talked about it as well. But this is a moment in time where, in a recession, if you lean in, you can truly create additional value. So that in the next, honestly, in the private equity world, things change so quickly. They're even talking about, 6 months from now. They're not talking about waiting 4 years for some sort of recession rebound. When they talk about the debt markets, they do it in 3 and 6 month increments. So even preparing right now and focusing on your base business and growing that at this moment while you work a parallel process to consider some sort of sale process is would be a very useful thing to do, because again, if you can show them in spite of a recession you grew, that's another feather in your cap. So the debt markets will influence the investment bankers, that will influence the different bidding markets for your potential business. Again, other pitfalls are people just don't even know where to begin, right? Like, do I just Google investment bankers or do I just like Google VC funding? What's interesting is once you've done it and you're in that world, you do tend to have more connectivity. So I've, kind of during and since the deal, I've gotten much more connected with various VC funds and private equity groups, and in similar circumstances where they might be looking for deals similar to mine that I can help them source, or looking for founders, owners who have a similar mindset. And so there's a little bit of that, get around something good and let something hit you aspect to having done this. And that's part of what I can provide to my clients as well.
So what spaces are you able to do that in? Because obviously, you having had an exit of your own, and this is very attractive. So other people are like, "Oh my gosh, like this sounds great. Let's hire Ryan right now."
And
Um,
get some of my friends
but
to do
yeah,
it with
what are
me.
some of the spaces that you could help somebody to source those or source capital into a deal? That would be a great fit to work with you.
So I've done, obviously, as a psychiatrist and having built 6 group practices, I'm very familiar with the healthcare space. There's nothing more kind of compliant, um, uh, laborsome than mental health. So when you think about just any kind of medical specialty, dental, I've worked in dental. My wife's a dentist. Shawn, we've talked a fair bit about chiropractic space, physical therapy, and those are the same portfolio roll-up companies that these private equity groups do. They tend to, if they're going to do healthcare, they tend to do all different aspects of healthcare, not just one, right? So they diversify their portfolio through rolling out chiropractic, dental, mental health, physical health stuff. So there's a lot of connectivity into multi-state, multi-site healthcare. But I've worked in tech. I've worked with, in fact, the client I'm working with right now, I mentioned earlier about just kind of tying up loose ends legally, is actually it's kind of a mix of healthcare and tech. But predominantly healthcare, some tech, and honestly, most of what I've been through and learned would be relevant to most entrepreneur business like ventures.
So when you say exit sounds like I exit, I leave the business, I'm gone, I'm done, I wash my hands of it. But I know that that's not always true. Sometimes there is obligations beyond that after you actually sell. Maybe they want to keep you on, or there could be different scenarios. So what could that look like for somebody if they were exiting?
Yeah, it's a great question, Lacey. So exit it well, first of all, it depends on who you're exiting to, right? So again, this concept of private equity who's going to take a majority stake of your business, they're investing in your business, but they usually don't want you to just walk out the door at day one. So there's usually some, as you're negotiating a deal, there's the value on your business, but then there's the value of you. And that
Mhm.
includes, what's your non-compete terms, how long is it, what's the radius, what's your new job and your new title going to be, and how's that fit into your prior role, and what's that look like in the future. So when you're negotiating terms of a deal, you're negotiating it not just on behalf of your business, but on behalf of you. And there's obviously, the longer they want you to do a non-compete, especially in healthcare, the higher that value can get. But the at the end of the day, there's how you negotiate, those terms. But there's also, how you negotiate terms for your team, right? There's this whole process of what are they going to do. So that's kind of private equity. Startup funding or VC funding really is, again, even more so an investment in you. They believe in your concept. You're maybe a little bit further on than just an idea, but generally speaking, they want you to lead that. And if they don't, if they plan to bring in their own team or supplant you at some point, again, you want to make sure you will have negotiated what does a good severance package look like if you don't, if you're fearful of them coming in and doing some sort of takeover. Um, so it depends on who you're selling to. That might kind of dictate what the terms and what an exit looks like. And a lot of that comes back to what value they see in you, and there's kind of near and long term. And again, we can talk about negotiating board seats and advisory stuff, and there's all sorts of different things you could do, especially if you are a little bit more advanced in your career and this really is an exit for you. But all of it comes back to how you value yourself and how you negotiate those terms in that process.
Love it.
Well, that's interesting because, like when somebody thinks about selling a practice
Mhm.
and you're in the service world, you have this idea of how much it's worth. Like, give us an idea because
Mhm.
we're very comfortable here on None of Your Business. Like, what does that mean? Because not a lot of people have experience because what we think typically is like, well, again, that's just a Dr. Wakem. Like, you
Right.
got to have like 9 million offices and you do a roll up and you get cashed out for
Tons of
hundreds of millions
money.
of dollars. But let's say that I had, just a handful of offices. I had maybe 5 offices, and I was looking at this. I'm like, all right, so you've got my attention. What sort of a multiple are we looking at? Number one, and how much of that is negotiable? What are the terms? Like, because also people think like somebody's just going to come in. You're going to
Write
be
you a
like,
check?
yeah, well, you're going to think, I don't know how this
Oh.
works. So somebody's just going to come on and say, hey, look, I'm going to give you $10 million, and you're going to be like, okay. How much is, you mentioned board seats, staying on? What are some of the points that we need to be aware of that are potentially negotiable in an exit?
So non-compete, board seat is another one, depending on what you're rolling in and how big that is. Multiples can really range. Again, if you're I'll just tell you, like in healthcare right now, if you're part of a roll-up strategy and you're a tuck-in, you're a single office, you just happen to be geographically located close to a cluster of other offices, your multiple's probably 3 to 4x, and the X on EBITDA. So going back to Lacey's question earlier, if you purposely drain every last penny out of your business, then 4 times zero is zero. But So that would be a tuck-in. If a true like multi-site, maybe even multi-state, you could start approaching 8 to 10 times EBITDA. So let's assume you had 4 offices that were each contributing 250,000 of EBITDA. That's $1 million across 4 offices times 8. I mean, that would be an $8 million exit. Just back of the napkin. So it really does depend on how big you scale, what kind of platform, what kind of centralization of services you've done. There's some tech industries trading at 100x, right? I mean, there are tech companies, even startups, that will end up at some crazy multiple of like what would be considered adjusted EBITDA, which is like, hey, we don't actually even have margin, but we're going to kind of squint and see A, B, and C as what's called an add back. So we're going to say, hey, all this was startup, we'll add that back. All this was tech IP, we'll add that back. And, we come up with some number that everyone can get comfortable with. And now we'll times it by 100. So,
Yeah.
I mean, it really can range. But, that's kind of 3 rough estimates on where things stand.
All right. So
But hang on. Here's what I want everybody to hear. I'm gonna make sure everybody heard this. If you had a 250,000 EBITDA and
Yep.
you had 4 offices,
Mhm.
you've got $1 million in EBITDA.
Yep.
You're exiting somewhere between like $4 and $8 million on your exit. Again, back of napkin, but I think that should get a lot of people's attention.
Right.
It's not.
At
That's
least
not.
should get you considering what
And that's
th-
not
how
out
this
of
would look
reach.
for
We're
you.
not
No,
saying
not
like,
at
well,
all.
if you're doing
$2
$10
million,
billion,
or you have a $5 million practice, then it's time
yeah.
to maybe look at selling.
So this is very
250
interesting.
across 4 is
I'm
not
sorry,
much.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. You
Well,
have
no,
a
this
very
is good
important.
because that's important, because it's like you said, it's probably piquing people's interest, and they're saying, "Man, I really need to connect with Ryan. I want to start considering this." So I want to know, in working with clients, what do you think is the number one thing that when they work with you, you help them overcome? Their
So the
biggest
first,
obstacle.
yeah, the biggest obstacle, quite honestly, is this emotional attachment to their business and
Mm.
what it even
Yes.
looks like to consider selling it, right? And that kind of strikes me near and dear as being a psychiatrist, which is I understand that emotional attachment. Again, I very much had the same, and I'm trained in being able to detach pretty well. But this concept of it's mine, and the idea of letting that go to someone else, and this concept that they're going to come in, ruin everything, they're going to fire all my people, they're going to, just ruin my reputation, everything I've built. And the reality is that would make no sense to the private equity group, because if they came in and ruined everything you built and created, why are they investing in you to begin with? Why not just go start it on their own? So this whole mindset of they're going to screw it up, right? And that was actually really tough for me as a seller. At the time, I had 130 some odd employees and their families that relied on us for their livelihood, and to be able to convince to them in the middle of COVID, nonetheless, not in person, that we are turning this over. We kind of, we birthed this baby. We kind of raised the baby, and here we are now. I've taken it, or we've taken it as far as we can go. Now it's time to pass it on into better hands, and truly believing that, and then being able to convey that appropriately. And I still sit as a chief medical officer of that organization over a year later, because I didn't just believe it then, I believe it now. And so getting over that mindset of, not only why I would sell, but who I'm going to sell to, and the fact that it actually could create betterment for everyone, including your patients, and access to care if you were to actually go through with it.
This one's just a rapid fire one, but so it sounds like you did your exit during COVID. You don't look that old. We can't see gray hairs on the top of your head.
Those are wisdom hairs.
What was the time? What was the
Yeah.
time? What was the time period from opening to your exit?
So we went from first office, and you've heard the story, but first office to selling in 8 years, and knowing no business, had no idea what the heck I was doing. Like you said at the very beginning of the podcast, school of hard knocks. I just happened to have enough money and time to overcome my mistakes, And then, really last couple of years, was able to really create an inflection point and get to where I got to. But, that's the part about coaching or mentoring or understanding who could help you, because you can change that trajectory so much quicker. If I didn't have a non-compete right now and I was able to go start another outpatient mental health business, I would get it way further, way quicker, and be able to turn it much, much sooner. And it's because I made spent the first 5 years just making a bunch of mistakes and learning from those and improving upon them, and then creating, the eventually the scale and exit that I needed.
So you received one day either a check or a direct deposit into your bank account, a sum of money, probably potentially bigger than you ever dreamed would ever come in as a deposit. What does life look like after, the next day? What do you do? You like big party, rent out a yacht, go to what do you do?
So when I initially signed the letter of intent, which, as you know, is non-binding, um, of course, all these wild ideas get into your head, right? Like, where am I going? How am I getting there? What am I going to do when I'm there? Um, for me, it was double checking the bank account to make sure the money was there, and then business as usual, right? As you know, I have a couple of different enterprises. Um, my mindset was definitely different. It's you're in a different position when you wake up and you have that kind of financial security. But that didn't change my drive. It didn't change my purpose. Didn't change what I wanted to keep going and doing. So don't get me wrong. Like, I had some fun. We did a little trip, um, but it I had very much conflated what I was going to do compared to what I actually did, just kind of setting myself up for disappointment. um, and because my wealth manager is telling me, no, you're not going to go, buy this plane or do this yacht. Um, you're gonna keep working. So I am young enough to still be able to do that. And to Lacey's question earlier, for me, exit was just a stepping stone and, into a new direction. Um, but for most people, especially if you've built something and you're an entrepreneur, you really want to see that through, and you may also want to do something. You may want to take that opportunity to go do something that you find even more passionate or even more purposeful.
Yep.
And that's what I chose to do.
I love that story. Listen, I hope that every single person that listens to this podcast, and I sincerely mean that, every single person that listens to this podcast considers, what is my end game?
Yep.
And I hope that people will jump on the endgame.coach. The endgame.coach. You need an end game coach. Like, we got to figure out, like, what does this look like at the end? And if you are lucky enough to be able to work with Dr. Ryan Wakim, man, like, let's just run some numbers. Like, take your EBITDA. If you don't know what that is, you got to figure that out. He can help
Yes.
you. 4x, 8x, 10x. Like, what does that look like? And
100x if you're
well, if you're in the tech world, I mean,
Wow.
we have a couple
Still,
couple
that
listeners.
number is
Yeah.
like, wow.
We are
Yeah.
world friends. But
We do.
what would that mean to you in your life, right? And also, too, look, you can negotiate some of this stuff. It doesn't mean that if you're young enough, it doesn't mean you're out of the
forever,
game.
yeah.
It doesn't mean you're out forever. Negotiating your non-competes, as Ryan was saying, like, if I could do it again, like, I know I could even shorten that time continuum even more. Probably build my business even more. Probably get out with even more on my exit. Well, that's what he's here to do for you. I mean, I've never even heard of this. There's nobody that's teaching you how to figure out your end game. And along comes Dr. Ryan Wakim. We're super blessed that he agreed to be on the podcast. He can help you. You need to talk to this guy. www.theendgame.coach. Not .com. Is it the endgame, right? Or just endgame?
Just Endgame.
Oh my
Just
gosh.
Endgame. That's what I thought. That's what I thought.
Endgame.
Okay.
Endgame.coach. You should
No,
stop me. We're gonna put it in, we're gonna put it in the show
I
notes.
did stop you.
We're gonna put it in the show notes. In www.endgame.coach. It doesn't matter. It does matter. I hope there's somebody smart is going to take the endgame.coach and they're going to steal all your business, right? You got to go to endgame.coach. you should be so lucky enough to have a conversation with Dr. Ryan Wakim. Talk about his experience, talk about what he could do for you. I personally, I don't know of anybody that's listening to this podcast that does not need to reach out and have a conversation. I mean, this solves a lot of things for a lot of people. How do we wrap this up? How do we end? Kind of like this podcast.
And maybe it's he's going to help you with the end game, so you can prepare for your next game. I love that he said that.
I love that too.
You know, I love that he said that about being able to do what you're more passionate about next. So much opportunity.
Ryan, any last words for the audience?
No, I appreciate you guys having me on, and I look forward to helping as many people as I can.
I love it.
Reach out to Ryan Wakim. He is a true treasure and a true gift to every single one of you. I don't think we've had a podcast that's more valuable to our listeners. And I hope that you truly will take advantage of this resource. Reach out to Dr. Ryan Wakim, www.endgame.coach. That's where you can find him. Dr. Ryan Wakim, thank you so much for being with us. Anything else to add?
Nope.
All right, everybody. We're going to be back again next week with a brand new episode of the None of Your Business podcast. Thank you so much for your listening and viewing. Make sure that you like, subscribe, share, leave us a review. Let us know what you think of the podcast. We'll see you next week.